Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 123. In this episode today, we will cover a massive book in the science fiction genre. It's a book that is so expansive, a story that is so expansive that for some people, including the two people that we have here today to talk about the book, it sets the standard for world building and for understanding politics, economics, history, ecology, and even that hoary old subject that keeps rearing its ugly head in even our postmodern time, religion. Now, this book was not on my radar or even our radar initially as a book to cover on the podcast. However, when I talked with one of our co-hosts today, as a result of a random networking outreach conversation last year, his enthusiasm, his overwhelming enthusiasm for this book today, and his knowledge of the underlying applications to leadership convinced me that it was worth consideration for all of you. And I was not disappointed. And in the interest of full disclosure, I was exposed to this book for the first time at 9 years old and was not necessarily impressed by the content. And I moved on to Stephen King, Dean Koontz, and Peter Straub. And arguably, this was probably because the version that I was reading and that I was initially exposed to was printed in tiny 9-point font type, which of course makes it intimidating for any 9-year-old. Today, we will be covering the book that is the basis for two recent films released in 2021 and 2023, respectively, and a film version that would rather be forgotten by most casual readers of the book or even hardcore fans, released in 1984 and written and directed by David Lynch. Today, we will be pulling leadership lessons from Dune by Frank Herbert. Leaders, there are deserts everywhere, from the deepest inner mind all the way to the outer limits. And the most arid desert in need of water is probably the one right between your ears. Now, today we will be joined in our conversation by the man who pitched Frank Herbert's epic novel to me, the past VP of Sales at Intergrowth, a global leader in executive search and leadership development, and the current Chief Philanthropy Officer at the Food Bank of Alaska, direct from deep in the wilds of the largest state in the Union. And yes, I am in Texas, and even we must bow to Alaska. Daniel Bentle. And of course, we will also be joined today by a longtime friend of the show, coming back from episode number 110, where we covered Night by Eli Wiesel with Libby Unger, Ryan J. Stout. Hello, and welcome to the podcast, Dan, and welcome back, Ryan. How y'all doing today?
Fantastic. Thank you. And yourself?
I'm spectacular. I'm always good. How are you doing, Dan?
Incredible. It's good to reconnect. It's hard to believe Jesan was a year ago.
I know. We were just saying that before we hit record. So
I remember glowing after that discussion on Dune for like the next 24 hours. So finding someone who could see it. So
well, and it definitely is. You definitely, and that's, I mean, what I said there in the opening, you definitely convinced me that it was worth my time to consider this book and to kind of overcome my 9-year-old angst about it that I'm carrying around in my 40s. And, you know, it turned out that, and we'll talk about the structure of the book and the content and all that kind of stuff coming up here. I only have one major complaint about the book, honestly, And then that's it. Like everything else I was fine with. And then I went and I looked a little bit at Frank Herbert's life, and we'll talk about the literary life of Frank Herbert here in a little bit, as we often do on the podcast. That way we have some grounding for the author as well. But in reading the book, I was fascinated by just the depth of everything that was built into it. Exactly what you talked about when you and I had the initial conversation. So yeah,
It's dense. It's dense. But in your defense, Jesan, I think I would still be intimidated with 9.5.
Yeah, I would open it and be like, nah.
yeah, we're down here. And Ryan, it's been a while. Had you even read Dune before? We have never even talked about it.
I got Dune. Someone gave it to me when I was out in Portland, Oregon. I was just working at a coffee shop, and this guy came in and he was carrying a copy of Dune. And I said, I never got around to that. He said, this is the best book I've ever read. This is my third time reading it. In fact, I have like 3 copies. You can have this copy. And so do you know when you see like astrophysicists just show like a taught sheet to explain the fabric of space-time, and they push down on it, and that's what this book reminds me of, is like pushing down on the center, and the gravity of it is so much that you can't not, but a reader, feel like your world is also being pulled in, because it is so relatable because of the archetypal characters. And so it automatically almost forces the reader to be immersed into it. And it's written in a way, and the language that's used is accessible enough, and with a dictionary and a glossary and all that. So, I mean, it's a commitment,
Yeah.
But well worth it.
Well, and I liked I'll be honest, I liked the structure of it. Like once I sort of gotten past my own like ennui or angst or whatever about it, I liked the structure of the book. Now the version that I have is structured in a particular way. It is the let's see, I just have to give credit where credit is due. It is the Ace Penguin Random House version of this book, and the paperback version. And the way they put this together was in August of 2005. So I guess this came out, in anticipation, well, not necessarily anticipation of the movie, but re-released for another generation. The way it was put together, there's appendices that are in the back of it. So there's like 20 pages of appendices in addition to the core elements of the book. There's terminology, there's cartographic notes, there's a map, and then there's an afterword by Frank Herbert's son, Brian Herbert, which I have not had a chance to read yet. But that's the basic structure. And then it sort of opens up with, a quote from the Manual of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan. And so it's set up in a way, and you'll need to know this if you're going to read the book as a leader. It's set up as in a way, to Ryan's point, to sort of draw you in to a world immediately. And it's not, weirdly enough, it's not Star Wars. Like that's what I expected. Like it's not a Star Wars kind of epic. It's not even a Star Trek kind of epic. It's something totally different. So I like the structure of the book. I like the way things are put together. I like the way that everything was collected together, sort of to kind of make it easily accessible, at least in my version, which again was more accessible than the one that I initially ran into all those years ago. All right.
I know this isn't the subject here, Jesan, but you both talked about how accessible it is.
Mm-hmm.
And those who are familiar with Frank Herbert's books in the series, what I'm told is that they become increasingly less accessible as you go on.
Yeah.
Especially for the average reader. I stopped after book 3. It's pretty weird.
Okay. Is it almost like reading I don't know, like a thesaurus or something? Does it go like, is it like reading more of a, like, is it written prose wise?
I think what I gather makes it far less accessible is even something I think the most recent director. I always butcher his surname, but Denis Villeneuve, who directed the last two films that Jesan referenced, had just talked about how esoteric they become after book 3, and just kind of just how out there the concepts are, and just what kind of happens to some of the characters and time jump. It gets very sci-fi. So I think that's
makes me want to go on.
yeah. So
Well, let's
topic for another time.
That's a topic for another time. Let's open up with Dune, and as usual with books that are a little bit more recent, I'm going to pick a particular quote. I'm going to focus on that, and then we're going to jump into the literary life of Frank Herbert. We're going to talk a little bit with both Dan and Ryan about sort of the meaning of this book, and what we have to look forward to here. So Dune opens with book 1, which is called Dune, and we open up with 2 characters, actually 3 characters, Jessica, Reverend Mother, and Paul Atredies. Now, the relationship between Paul and his mother, Jessica, is critical to the moving forward of the plot of Dune, as well as the nuances of the relationship between Paul's father and the Duke, Duke Leto. And so we're going to talk about that and address that, but I'd like to focus on this just at the beginning. The Reverend Mother, Gaius Helen Mohayim, sat in a tapestried chair watching mother and son approach. Windows on each side of her overlooked the curving southern bend of the river and the green farmlands of the Atredies family holding, but the Reverend Mother ignored the view. She was feeling her age this morning, more than a little petulant. She blamed it on space travel and association with that abominable spacing guild and its secretive ways. But here was a mission that required personal attention from a Bene Gesserit with the sight. Even the Padishah, Emperor's truthsayer, couldn't evade that responsibility when the duty call came. Damn that Jessica, the Reverend Mother thought. If only she'd born us a girl, as she was ordered to do. Jessica stopped 3 paces from the chair, dropped a small curtsy, a gentle flick of the left hand along the line of her skirt. Paul gave the short bow his dancing master had taught, the one used, quote, when in doubt of another station, unquote. The nuances of Paul's greeting were not lost on the Reverend Mother. She said, "He's a cautious one, Jessica." Jessica's hand went to Paul's shoulder, tightened there. For a heartbeat, fear pulsed through her palm, that she had herself under control. Thus he has been taught, your reverence. What does she fear? Paul wondered. The old woman studied Paul in one gestalten flicker. I love that term, by the way. Face oval like Jessica's, but strong bones, hair. The Duke's black, but with brow line of the maternal grandfather who cannot be named, and that thin, disdainful nose, shape of directly staring green eyes, like the old Duke, the paternal grandfather who is dead. Now, there was a man who appreciated the power of bravura, even in death, the Reverend Mother thought. And so this is the setup that brings us into this idea of Paul being tested, right? Of Paul being trained. Well, not really being trained. It comes at the end of his training, right? The beginning of his testing time, right? And this sets up some of the other challenges that are going to rise through the book, particularly challenges around, spoiler alert, the death of the Duke, the challenges of Jessica and Paul going to a new world, which is not like the world that they just left, and ultimately the challenges of being human. And there's a touch of, I don't know if it's commentary or thought process in this book about evolution, which I want to ask Dan about. But that's how we open Dune. We're literally tossed into the fray right away. And this kind of goes along with, I think, how Frank Herbert was as a human being, right? How he structured his own life. And so Franklin Patrick Herbert Jr. was born October 8th, 1920, and died February 11th, 1986. He was an American science fiction author who wrote short stories and worked as a newspaper journalist, a photographer, a book reviewer, an ecological consultant, and a lecturer. He was fascinated by books as a young man and could read much of the newspaper before the age of 5, had an excellent memory, and learned quickly. Probably a little bit didactic, as well as being a little bit of having a little bit of photographic memory. Due to an impoverished home environment, largely due to the Great Depression, Herbert left home in 1938 to live with an aunt and uncle in Salem, Oregon. During 1942, after the U.S. entry into World War II, he served in the U.S. Navy's Seabees for 6 months as a photographer, but suffered a head injury and was given a medical discharge. He never graduated from college. According to his son Brian, he wanted to study only what interested him, and so did not complete the required curriculum. Now we're on a month of science fiction books, and that's why we're talking about Dune. And we talked about Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451. Ray Bradbury also during the Depression did not go to college. And part of the reason why Fahrenheit 451 is the way that it is, and we talked about this in that episode number 122. He said, Bradbury did, and I quote, "It was the Depression. Everyone was poor. No one could afford to go to college. We all just went to the library." and Frank Herbert definitely did that as well. Herbert's first science fiction story, Looking for Something, was published in the April 1952 issue of Startling Stories. And he began researching Dune in 1959, and it was published in 1965, which, of course, spearheaded the Dune franchise, by the way. Dune is the best-selling science fiction novel of all time, and the Dune saga, set in the distant future and taking place over a millennia, explores complex themes such as the long-term survival of the human species, human evolution, planetary science and ecology, and the intersection of religion, politics, economics, sex, and power in a future where humanity has long since developed interstellar travel and colonized many thousands of worlds. He later told, many years after Dune was published, and this is of particular interest, I think, to Ryan. He later told Willis E. McNelly that the novel originated when he was assigned to write a magazine article about sand dunes in the Oregon Dunes near Florence, Oregon. But another possible source of inspiration for Dune was Herbert's purported experiences with psilocybin mushrooms, according to the mycologist Paul Stamets account, which describes Herbert's hobby of cultivating chanterelles, which are those like weird little mushrooms that have like the ruffled edges, and they make you trip. They send you all kinds of different places. That's a little bit about the literary life of Frank Herbert and a little bit about Dune. Dan brought us Dune, so I'd like to give him first crack at this. Talk to us about the importance of Dune on you and your life and your creativity and your leadership. And then Ryan, I want you to talk with us a little bit about the challenges of reading it. What does that look like? So Dan, lay it on us.
Jesan, thank you. Yeah, it was fun to think back on this. I think I read it when I was just about 14 years old for the first time. I've read it a few times. It was probably freshman or sophomore in college. Found it on a list of like 28, 40 books or something like that we could choose from. And it was a tome. So yes, it was intimidating, as you said. But I liked the cover. It looked interesting, and I've always loved the smell of old books. And it was an old books and coffee, two favorite smells. In fact, this book talks about coffee and the importance of coffee service, in a relationship too, which was also super cool. But it was just dense. I mean, it was layers of, as you said, commentary on politics, religion, ecology. It planted the seed of an interest in just overall environmental sustainability for me, which I spent a portion of my career within. But initially, it was just the adventure and the world building that kind of drew me in. I mean, again, I was 14 years old and could, immediately see the clear influence that it had had on pop culture, the ways that it had been influenced by other works. But yeah, it was certainly probably the second or third time when I became of reading it, when I came to a more maybe conscious appreciation of the importance of some leadership lessons that were kind of woven through. I think I remember reading somewhere recently that I think it was Tim Ferriss or someone who was quoted in saying that anything critical you need to know about leadership, you can learn by reading Dune or something to that effect, which I think is probably a bit of a stretch, but it is certainly interesting to have seen that. I've seen it on different lists from, I think Elon Musk to others who've referenced it. But there were certainly, I do remember there being specific points when reading into some of the dialogue, especially in the relationship between the protagonist, Paul, and his father, the Duke, just some of the ways in which he talked about how his father led and what he was learning from him in his position of leadership. That certainly got my wheels turning at a very young age. I think there's even a quote where Duke Leto talks about, what it means to be a leader. I think he says, what is important for a leader is that which makes him a leader, the needs of his people. Which, a 14-year-old kid kind of reading that and understanding, kind of thinking through all like, well, what are the factors and context that requires a leader to emerge in and how they lead, which is important. But even things like give as few orders as possible, I think Leto says, right? Once you've given orders on a subject, you will always be required to give orders on that subject or something to that effect, which just speaks to the importance of keeping it simple for those involved in a mission, right? Not micromanaging, even at the furthest end of that, and ensuring that sort of the key message, the mission is paramount in people's minds and they never forget it, and trust them to get the job done, for them to do so. Which certainly wasn't thinking about it at that depth, again, the first time I read it, but certainly had an impact upon me. In fact, I'm in a new office here and getting set up, and I have very little on the walls.
Mm-hmm.
But the first thing I actually did put up on the wall right behind me is a gift from my baby sister, who I just saw in Portland, Oregon last weekend, Ryan. And it is the Litany Against Fear, which I have framed up there. And that is the only thing aside from the whiteboard on the other side of the room that is on the wall so far. So
that's awesome.
Just for you, sir. Just for you.
I'll grab your address from Jesan. I'll mail you something to put on the wall.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm a minimalist by nature, although my wife would probably not agree with that statement.
Well, there's always two partners or not two partners, always two kinds of people in a relationship. There's the person who's the minimalist, and then there's the person who's maybe a little bit left or right, depending upon your perspective of the minimalist, who's always considered by that minimalist to be a maximalist.
Also depends on the context you're talking about, right? In what area of life?
That's correct. That's right. You said a bunch of different stuff there, Dan, and I took a bunch of notes. I want to jump into a few things there. But first, Ryan, I know, you told us the story about how you kind of structured, not how you structured, how you ran into Dune and how you got your copy and how you thought about it. For me, reading it, and I've already mentioned this already, reading it at 45, significantly different, obviously, than trying to touch on it at 9 or even, to Dan's point, 14, right? Or as a freshman in college. You're reading it with all the kinds of experiences that you've had, underneath your belt. That's what you're bringing to the game. What did you find in Dune?
It is. The age is huge. Experience is huge. As I've gotten older, instead of getting bogged down on details, it's more like the abstractions of things. And the challenge. I think the biggest challenge is what Dan and maybe Jesan. I don't think yours is intimidated by, but 900 pages is like a lot. It's pretty. And going into it knowing that it's going to be really dense material.
Mm-hmm.
That the number of characters, the names of the characters, how to keep the characters in their houses, which houses represent what. And so this all starts to compile, and without some note-taking or references to other material in a short period of time, it just becomes way too quickly overwhelming. I think the challenge there was parts of, or either you're familiar with the show House MD. With House, so. The show House with
House. House. Yeah. Okay.
And so a lot of that show is, a couple seasons go on, it's built upon layering stratagems in order to have people reveal something. And it seems like there's a lot of that dialogue. So they're going to think this if I do this. So I'm going to do this. So they'll think this. And therefore it will mend or take care of or address this particular issue. So there's a lot of just abstract thinking that goes on within the book, and how the Duke kind of is structuring his responsibilities. And like there was one, I think, a challenge too is like the environment in a way. Maybe it's because the dialogue, maybe it's because people, when they thousands of years in the future evolve, don't have as it didn't seem to be. It's like there was a less focus on, say, like the emotional responses. So there's not a lot of like reactions, and I guess that could also say to like the Duke's leadership skill of kind of remaining calm.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I would not have known how to articulate that, but I did pick up on that as well. And I think that goes partially to obviously who Herbert is as a writer, or was as a writer. What are the things that he focused on, right? Because he's going to write, what he's going to write, right? From that particular perspective, because he's creating this thing. But Frank Herbert also, weirdly enough, I mean, reading a little bit more into him, he seemed to be a person who was very, and I'm sure people, have all kinds of different, obviously, not knowledge, but people have all different kinds of experiences during the course of their life, right? He seemed to be a person who was very intentional about some of the things that he did. And I don't know if that was because of the head injury that discharged him in World War II from the Seabees. I don't know if that's just because of the path that he went down and the particular way that he was raised, but he seemed to have in the course of his life, a lot of intentionality behind who he was as a person. And then the creative part of him that came out in science fiction seemed to be unlocked by other things that he was doing, like the psilocybin mushrooms, and the sort of that sort of messing around with that a little bit. Now again, I've known plenty of people who are more maybe more conservative in their temperament. I don't mean politically conservative, just conservative in their temperament, that do need that other thing to be unlocked inside of them so they can access a whole bunch of stuff. But once they go behind that door, they kind of get spooked sometimes. To your point about emotion, Ryan, they kind of get spooked by the strength of whatever that thing is back there, and they slam that door shut real quick. And I looked at Dune as his attempt to put that into its appropriate bucket, right, wherever it came from, but to put that thing in its appropriate bucket and channel it in a particular direction. And it's interesting, Dan, we were talking before we hit record, that, and you mentioned this, that subsequent books become more esoteric and become more, it's like you got, I hate to say it this way, but it's like Frank Herbert got high on his own supply, and sort of went down that rabbit hole a little bit deeper.
Maybe so. Maybe so. It's certainly what I've heard, and I think the level of or at least on kind of the overall accessibility, the first three books are sort of that trilogy, are the only that have been adapted so far into anything outside of the novels, right? And I think that kind of speaks to kind of what's going to sell, but also I think it's and we can, I'm sure, get into this a little bit as well, but the first two books really seem to be the full arc of the primary protagonist and the message around the purported message of Frank Herbert's around the danger of following overly charismatic leaders, and that being, really sort of the rise and fall of an empire, and that sort of contained piece, and then the rest of it. There's certainly an audience for that, but maybe a little bit different one than the general populace had an appetite for.
Right.
How much of the book do you think is null and void if the Harkonnens just like left really good machinery, and then he just carried on as usual? It would be like a show. It would be a short story of like 12 pages. They left us this wonderful machinery. We harvested the spice without a hitch.
We're
what
done.
a transition.
We're out.
So it's like Be Kind, Rewind. That's Maybe that's where that came from.
Yeah, the Harkonnens just needed to open up a blockbuster franchise. That's really all they needed to do. It's just like back in the day.
Well, I'm sure you're both, read into this. I don't know that I fully appreciated, this and reading through the machinations of the houses when I first read it at 14.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that was the Harkonnens' first step,
Mm-hmm.
intentional first step in laying the trap.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if they would have all just been kind to one another and there was no animosity, I don't think we'd have any great stories.
Well, and we're gonna talk about this in the next section. I kind of want to hold my powder, keep my powder dry a little bit here. And I will say that when we talk about the houses, I immediately thought of, and of course it was the environment too. I immediately thought of Lawrence of Arabia. Matter of fact, I actually wanted to go get my copy of T.E. Lawrence's Seven Pillars of Wisdom and kind of read it alongside Dune, just to see, was Herbert reading T.E. Lawrence's mail, as they say these days? Was he collecting receipts on T.E. Lawrence? Because and we've covered Seven Pillars of Wisdom on this podcast. There are remarkable parallels between the observations that T.E. Lawrence has, particularly in the first couple of, I'd say the first 200 pages of Seven Pillars of Wisdom, that are reflected in some of the behavior that the houses get up to, and that Leto and Atredies get into, and that the Ben Gesserit, are involved in. There's some interesting parallels there, and I know that Herbert was widely read, so it wouldn't surprise me if that was an influence there. And that's why sort of I came up with, and we'll talk about this in the second turn here, but this T.E. Lawrence idea of, and I loved it the way he put it in Seven Pillars of Wisdom, never outstay a climax, which is a hugely important lesson for leaders, and one that I think Lawrence, out of many leaders, I would say maybe George Washington was maybe the other one, kind of actually understood this and knew exactly when to leave. And most leaders have no clue when to leave. And then they wind up like Leto, and they fall into the trap of their enemies. So,
also making yourself scarce.
Well, I mean, yeah, making yourself scarce. I mean, well, and this gets into succession and a whole bunch of things. Yeah. Let me ask you this, a follow-up question for this, and then we'll move on. Follow-up question for this. So you mentioned Tim Ferriss and Elon Musk reading this book. Obviously, for our listeners, if it's good enough for Elon Musk, it's good enough for you. So go grab a copy of Dune. Even if you don't read the rest of them, you don't have to read Children of Dune or Dune on Mars or whatever the other books are. Don't worry about it. Just get the first one. This idea of not micromanaging, building trust, give as few orders as possible. This idea of emergent leadership, right, that we see in Dune. If I am a charismatic leader, what's the warning here for me in this book?
Yeah, if you are that charismatic leader.
Right.
Let me touch on that really quickly, but I also want to maybe just rewind before I lose this thought on the T.E. Lawrence front, if I may, Jesan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a really, really great, and I'll just put a plug for this because I received this as a Christmas gift this last Christmas, was a coffee table book. See the coffee, just coming back to coffee.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, bring it back.
And it even touches on it in this coffee table book on sort of the worlds of Dune, the cultures, and the places and historical figures that inspired the book, by Tom Huddleston. And it is just a phenomenal kind of just fun kind of read to look at, and touches heavily upon the Seven Pillars of Wisdom and T.E. Lawrence as well. But back to your question on sort of what's the warning if you are a charismatic leader here. I think there's certainly a warning against ambition for the sake of ambition. Just the age-old message that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly a pretty clear message of the book is one that I didn't necessarily get as a 14-year-old, which was, Paul, he ultimately, succumbs and becomes the dictator that he overthrows.
Mm-hmm.
And that you can become high on your own product. Ego affects all of us, pride affects all of us, and it clouds our judgment. And that's why you cannot speak enough about or just self-examine enough on just ensuring you're maintaining a healthy dose of humility, and relying on others around you, and setting up the right systems and structures from a leadership perspective to govern effectively. What is the Bene Gesserit axiom in there around, religion and politics in the same cart? And of course, we all know that. But just sort of some of those concepts introduced or reintroduced or really emphasized for me at a young age were certainly very important. So, revenge and manipulation do play a heavy part in the book, even on behalf of the protagonist. And that, I think, just also speaks to, I'll take a maybe more spiritual or religious stance on that, we live in a fallen world, and that's part of our baser nature as humans. Revenge is a natural inclination. We want to see others experience the pain that they've caused us, and which is a major driver for the protagonist, Paul, in the story, and highlighted much more directly in the 2 recent films that came out. And you see, even in the choice, not to get too much into that, but even some of from a pacing and sort of length of story standpoint, some of the edits that had to be made and sort of decisions or actions that some characters took that were taken by others in the book, serves to highlight Paul's key motivation being revenge in that, and what it ultimately did to him.
Yeah.
And of course, we see that message reflected in other things that Dune had some influence on, including Star Wars and the teachings of Yoda, right? Leads down a dark path.
Yeah. So. Yeah, absolutely. Well, back to the book, back to Dune. I'm going to pick up a little bit here. So Paul and Jessica and the Duke leave their green planet, right? And they go to a desert with worms and spice and betrayal, a desert with corrupt commerce, right? And not even theocratically driven, that's not even it, monarchically driven people. A desert with rebels and people who have no business being in a desert but are, right? And this is, by the way, one of the other things about Dune that I want to put up just right up front. There's very little appeal to speaking of Star Wars for just a minute, or even Star Trek: The Next Generation, of which I'm a gigantic fan. There's very little appeal to this idea of multiple races across multiple worlds. We're dealing with human beings, and it's human beings that look like the kind of human beings that you can see on the video of this podcast today, right? 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. We're not dealing with Klingons or Jedi. We're not dealing with anything that's fantastical in terms of the actual human experience inside of Dune. We're dealing with people who have, yes, to a certain degree evolved, but they would still be recognizably human from our perspective if they came, quote unquote, back to our time. And Herbert did that on purpose. And so we pick up here in the middle of book 1, or actually closer towards the end. And it starts with this. My father, the Padishah emperor, took me by the hand one day, and I sensed in the ways my mother had taught me that he was disturbed. He led me down the hall of portraits to the ego likeness of the Duke Leto Atredies. I marked the strong resemblance between them, my father and this man in the portrait, both with thin, elegant faces and sharp features dominated by cold eyes. Princess daughter, my father said, I would that you'd been older when it came time for this man to choose a woman. My father was 71 at the time and looking no older than the man in the portrait, and I was but 14. Yet I remember deducing in that instant that my father secretly wished the Duke had been his son and disliked the political necessities that made them enemies. From In My Father's House by the Princess Irulan. And so that's kind of a quote that opens up the chapters, right? In my version of Dune. Your version, your mileage may vary. And then we jump into the text. His first encounter with the people that he'd been ordered to betray left Dr. Kynes shaken. He prided himself on being a scientist to whom legends were merely interesting clues, pointing towards cultural roots. Yet the boy fitted the ancient prophecy so precisely, he had that questing eyes and the air of reserved candor. Of course, the prophecy left certain latitude as to whether the mother goddess would bring the Messiah with her or produce him on the scene. Still, there was this odd correspondence between prediction and persons. They met in mid-morning outside the Arrakan landing fields administration building, an unmarked ornithopter squatted nearby, humming softly on standby like a somnolent insect. An Atredies guard stood beside it with bared sword and the faint air distortion of a shield around him. Kynes sneered at the shield pattern, thinking Arrakis has a surprise for them there. The planetologist raised a hand, signaled for his Freeman guard to fall back. He strode on ahead towards the building's entrance, the dark hole of the plastic-coated rock, so exposed that the monolithic building, he thought, so much less suitable than a cave. Movement within the entrance caught his attention. He stopped, taking the moment to adjust his robe and the set of his still suit at the left shoulder. Now pause. You've got fantastical elements in here, but it's with technology. That's also the genius of what Herbert's doing here. Back to the book. The entrance doors swung wide. Atredies guards emerged swiftly, all of them heavily armed, slow pellet stunners, swords, and shields. Behind them came a tall man, hawk-faced, dark of skin and hair. He wore a juba cloak with Atredies' crest on the breast and wore it in a way that betrayed his unfamiliarity with the garment. It clung to the legs of his still suit on one side. It lacked the free, swinging, striding rhythm. Beside the man walked a youth with the same dark hair, but rounder in the face. The youth seemed small for the 15 years Kynes knew him to have, but the young body carried a sense of command, a poised assurance, as though he saw and knew things all around him that were not visible to others. And he wore the same style cloak as his father, yet with a casual ease that made one think the boy had always worn such clothing. The Mahdi will be aware of things others cannot see, went the prophecy. Kynes shook his head, telling himself, they're just people. With the two, garbed like them for the desert, came a man Kynes recognized, Gurney Halleck. Kynes took a deep breath to still his resentment against Halleck, who had briefed him on how to behave with the Duke and the ducal heir. You may call the Duke my lord or sire. Noble born is also correct, but usually reserved for more formal occasions. The son may be addressed as young master or my lord. The Duke is a man of much leniency, but brooks little familiarity. And Kynes thought as he watched the group approach, they'll learn soon enough who's master on Arrakis. Order me questioned half the night by that mentat, will they? Expect me to guide them to an inspection of spice mining, do they? The import of Howat's questions had not escaped Kynes. They wanted the Imperial bases, and it was obvious they learned of the bases from Idaho. I will have Stilgar send Idaho's head to this Duke, Kynes told himself. The reason I read that is because Kynes is the planetologist, and he's our entry point into Arrakis. He's our entry point into this seemingly dead planet that has all kinds of other things going on in it. It is a planet that is a desert. It is a planet that is being mined for its spice. I got to admit, I'm still not really clear on what spice does. I just know it's valuable. And maybe that's in future books. I have some idea maybe that it has some hallucinogenic properties, but it also seems to be like an actual food. I'm not really clear. Point is, it's a resource like oil or water or sand. It's a resource that is prevalent on Arrakis, and it is also a resource that is apparently worth fighting and dying over. The planetologist Kynes, who doesn't make it to the end, spoiler alert, kind of understands and is beginning to understand that the point of the planet Arrakis is not the spice. The point is freeing people, particularly the freemen, to, interestingly enough, freedom, freeing them from the desert, turning the desert into a garden. This goes to the never-ending challenge, which I think Herbert was very focused on, of building a new world, even after humans have long since left planet Earth and moved on to different planets and galaxies. Herbert's vision of human troubles, desires, lusts, wars, and killings that seem to haunt human beings' best efforts at building a new world mirror the insights of T.E. Lawrence that he had as a result of experiencing the aftermath of the Arab Revolt during World War I. One of the ideas that a leader must know is when to leave the stage, as I already mentioned. And the biggest curse of the characters in Dune is that they all aren't in tune with the zeitgeist of when to leave the stage due to the depth and breadth of their egos. We already mentioned revenge, Dan, so I'm going to switch this to in here for this the opening part of this segment. Why is it important to leave on a high note, Ryan? You're a performer. Years ago on another project that we were involved in, because we've been friends for a long, long time, you told me always leave on a high note, always leave them, leave them clapping. And Jerry Seinfeld also mentioned this to George years ago on that show. And George, was twirling and left on a high note, right? And I've sort of tried to do that in my career, leave on a high note, but it's sometimes hard to figure out where that high note is. So let's open it up with you. Why is it important to leave on a high note?
So you've met Cousin Johnny, and I've talked to Cousin Johnny about
I've met Cousin Johnny
many times. So
you should tell Dan who Cousin Johnny is, because Dan doesn't know.
Cousin Johnny is a good time fellow who's a frequenter of bars and establishments, and has worked in restaurants for a long time, likes to gamble, travels, kind of gets out there. And but he always has like a short wired or like a hardwired like access to the shortcuts in his brain, where he can put things in take complex things and put it into simple terms, but he will openly admit that he can barely read. Mm-hmm. So it's like his ability to process information is really high. And so he's on the phone with someone, and I was like, who was that? And he told me it's some girl. And I was like, what was that conversation about? And he's just like, always keep them wanting more. And I was like, and we're sitting at a bar at TGI Fridays, and this is, this whole scenario. And it's like, but if you just take that line, and it has great value. And that's the first thing I thought of when it was like leaving on a high note. It was like, you're galvanizing the troops. Mm-hmm. You want the reaction of that of be like, yes, I'm fully invested, and whatever we're doing is the only thing is the thing we got to do. And I think that would be a primary goal of a leader, is to have all the people you're leading get along as some sort of familial unit, because there's strength in community. And when everyone's on the same page working towards a common goal, it almost doesn't feel like work.
Right.
And so, leaving on a high note is kind of like the path, the red carpet into that. Actualizing of the
actualizing of the leaving on a high note. Dan, what do we do with those people though, like Kynes or the Harkonnens, as Ryan already mentioned? What do we do with those people that just don't want to go along, or they have just, and I always ask this almost on every podcast, right? Because leaders invariably are going to run into conflict. Invariably. Matter of fact, I will tell leaders in the course of my leadership development work or training work or coaching and consulting work that I've done in this space for a long time now, I will tell them, if you are not experiencing conflict, you're probably not leading.
Yeah.
You're probably doing it badly, or because people aren't bringing you things that you need to hear, or your ego is so massive that you can't brook even positive conflict. And so everybody is doing another variation of this. Everybody's walking around you on eggshells. And you're actually in the process of losing your team. You won't be able to leave on a high note. You're going to get carted out the back, So what do leaders do? How do leaders respond to the Kynes of the world? How do they respond to those kinds of folks who have other agendas? Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us, that's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show.
Yeah, quickly before jumping in there, it's interesting. Kynes in the book eventually does kind of become a believer.
He does.
And so he comes along, and I think there's a lesson in that too, which is, there's a variety of ways to deal with those, and that's always contextual and situational, right? Leadership is and everyone needs to be led differently. And a really great leader will be able to switch gears well enough to be able to lead at a group and or individual level, lead people the way that they need to be led, which is part of one of the bigger challenges of leadership, and why it is certainly a craft to be learned. But I think some of that does come back to, and I think maybe to some degree in the case of Kynes, that if you're cultivating a familial environment, to Ryan's point, and building a new culture that is working for the larger majority, eventually people will self-select in or self-select out. And kind of calls back to some of the great works on getting the right people on the bus and getting the wrong people off. Sometimes those have to be more direct actions to get them off. Sometimes they will jump off, and that'll just come by very nature of seeing a new direction forming, and people will know when to exit, or they won't, and you'll have to unfortunately exit them yourself.
Right.
And that's difficult. That's the conflict I come back to, right? Sometimes that requires some difficult decisions to remove an obstacle for the team there as well. So certainly a challenging instance. But I did want to circle back to your point about, I had not pulled this out before, Jesan and Ryan. So I do want to appreciate the note on the importance of leaving on a high note, or knowing when to exit the stage, because I do think that's so important. And it's, I've been in my career long enough to have observed this play out positively and negatively, over time. But I do think it also, on the kind of flip side, if you will, internally, and speaks to the importance of being, to some degree, not always present, to some degree, like there's a distance between you as a leader and your team, that you can't be too familial. There does have to be some measure of sort of parental, position to be able to lead and to hold authority and to make the difficult decisions required of you in that position. And so not being overly present, cultivating an era of scarcity, is important. And I think even some of my favorite readings from graduate school, like The First 90 Days, for example, speaks to this and the importance of kind of establishing your expectations with the team and being accessible and maintaining an open door policy, but at the same time, not being too accessible. That there is a fine line, as there is with everything. So, and I hadn't necessarily pulled that out of Dune before, and that's a really good piece, especially as it relates back to T.E. Lawrence, I think, as you said, Jesan.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's actually why Duke Leto Atredies winds up in the spot that he winds up in. And it was sort of one of those things that it took me a little bit to click to, because I was trying to figure out, and we'll talk about the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen here in just a moment. We're going to talk about villains in a minute, but including that scuzzy little nephew of his. Anyway, you know, the kind of background I have, and Ryan knows a little bit about my background and knows a little bit about where I came from. Like, guys like that get clapped like quick. Like, they do a lot of damage, but they get clapped quick. Like, and we all like figure it out and like move on. But in polite society, I think as you go up the hierarchy, it gets a little bit harder to sort of reach out to those people and as my mother would say, snatch them bald headed. It becomes a little bit more of a challenge. But we'll talk about that in just a second. Because they have all these protectors around them and they have these walls around them. And there's certain things you can't do because of propriety and all that. Although I think a lot of that's has changed and is continuing to change. But this idea of, and again, I think that it kind of struck me. And it wasn't just a combination of, it wasn't just never outstay a climax, which is another variation of saying leave on a high note. It was also this idea, and I've been talking a lot about this lately. William Shakespeare writes in the great play Julius Caesar. There's a great scene, I think it's in Act 3 of Julius Caesar, where Caesar's talking to Calpurnia, right? And Calpurnia, his wife, is trying to get him to not go to the Senate because she senses that something is going to happen to him. And he says this great line. I love it. He goes, "Everywhere, always, I am Caesar." Like, why wouldn't, and then there's just dead silence there. And Shakespeare leaves that line just hanging there. He puts a period at the end of it and he just leaves the line hanging there, right? He doesn't put a comma, he doesn't leave anything else. Just everywhere, always, I am Caesar. And I think in our attempts to become more familiar with each other, and social media has done a piece of this, the internet has done a piece of this. I mean, Dan, you and I connected because of the internet. We connected because of LinkedIn, right? Because of a social media platform on the internet. We're all of a certain age. I'm in my mid 40s now, where we saw the internet come into fruition. We aren't that generation, that the one that's like a couple of generations behind us. We aren't the ones that were born into it and it was just here. We saw it develop, right? And so we've gone from my dad, who would have been in his 70s if he were still alive. My father would have no interest in the internet beyond just like, yeah, I mean, that's cool, but like, why do I want to talk to somebody in Australia? Now we've leapfrogged in 20 years to, no, we can't get away without this connection. But what this does is it brings a feeling of familiarity. And so when a leader is operating inside of this space, the tension is, am I familiar? Am I friends with my people on Facebook? Or do I need that distance? And people look at that distance, bless you, Ryan. People look at that distance as rejection, even though in reality, it is an idea, like you're talking about, that certain distance. Once you have that distance, then you know when to leave, I think, or you know when to stay. Now, Julius Caesar, of course, dies in the Senate. Duke Leto gets, of course, betrayed and dies, himself. And I think the sin of Leto and the sin of Caesar are the same, just on different sides of the coin. It's this idea that I overstayed my climax. I maybe shouldn't have gone to Arrakis. Maybe I should have just sent Paul. Maybe that would have been good enough. Now, Paul's 15, obviously. You're going to send a 15-year-old to do a man's job. Well, maybe then he avoids the Messiah nonsense that happens later on in the third part of Dune, or maybe he still runs into it, but just in a different kind of way. That's a nice little counterfactual there. I don't know, but I think of these kinds of things when I touch on this material.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
There's a lot there.
It's always it's a difficult one, and frankly, on a personal level, I've always struggled with that. sort of the, just the desire to be, close with and kind of friends with, and just the familial atmosphere you want to maintain with or cultivate with a team, and that buy-in at the same time maintaining a certain distance.
Right.
Or that's just how we're wired, how we're raised, our personalities, and that's why I think some personalities are better suited for leadership than others. It just kind of comes back to that. So, there's on the importance of knowing when to exit the stage. You asked an earlier question, Jesan, around, what is the warning for overly charismatic leaders too? I think there's a related warning here, around exiting the stage, that is reflected in one of my favorite lines from The Dark Knight. It's Christopher Nolan, right? It's like you die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
Right.
Which I think it resonates with us because, that's, again, been in my career long enough to have seen like almost any leader, regardless of how great they were. Once they're out of a role, you got a new leader coming in, people are comparing them, and you kind of forget about the great things they did, dependent upon, et cetera. And there's, people tend to vilify their leaders. So, knowing when to exit the stage and when you've done enough. You mentioned George Washington. I'm watching a phenomenal documentary on him right now. And just like, again, that's one of the greatest things. One of the reasons he's so well remembered. He knew when to exit the stage.
He knew when to put down power. He knew when to get
for the
out.
sake of us all.
For the sake of us all, right.
Future generations,
Yeah.
So it's an important one to remember.
Ryan, let's talk about the Baron. Let's talk about Baron Harkonnen for a little bit. You've had experiences in your life where people have just not liked your face.
I'm currently going through several of those relationships.
But no villain, to go back to The Dark Knight, honestly, right? The villain in The Dark Knight, the Joker, didn't think he was the villain. He thought he was just, well, he even said, I'm a dog. And by the way, it's one of my favorite movies too. I'm a dog chasing a car, or I wouldn't know what to do with it if I caught it. I'm just chaos. I just do things, right? The Baron, right? The Baron doesn't view himself as a villain. He views himself as protecting, and yes, he is a venal weasel. Let's just be very clear. But he views himself as protecting the spice, protecting the trade, protecting what makes his house valuable. And of course, if there's a side benefit to crushing another house, he's going to take that as well. Like, there's no way he's not going to take that extra off the table. He does not view himself as a villain. Ryan, what do we do when we don't view ourselves as a villain? How do we switch our brains on that?
I keep going back to how much of groups of people, or just people in this book, rely on the lore of their position or character. The Bene Gesserit's great. When she asks, "What is this?" and she says, "It's a." She's going to say it's a maker of death, but it's a maker, and it's the Chris knife, and it's like a misunderstanding that keeps Paul as the Messiah in. It keeps that alive. Restate it again.
So, when you're a villain, or if you don't see yourself as the villain, how do you, looking at the Baron and looking at his motivations, right? Like, how can he reset himself? I don't know if he can.
Well, I think so. The reason, butted up against, say, Leto, where it's like trying to establish trust. And that building, even if that he is the leader, and the Harkonnen, it's like, no, he's stating fact, and the confidence is very sure. Whereas I don't know, I think it's so revealing when Jessica says, when she just throws out, it's a maker. And so you're seeing someone sort of rely on deception, and where Harkonnen, it's like he's like it'll be like, oh, I'm going to deceive you. Don't take any. You know what I mean? Like it's very clear. He's not uh, trying to fool anybody about what or who he is.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and whereas uh, from the other end, it seems like coming into this new environment, figuring out how to. So it's I think a level of trust that needs. I mean, is anyone in the Harkonnen? Would you see an upheaval to go against?
No, but I think his nephew definitely wants to overthrow him. I think the nephew, but the nephew wants to overthrow him because that's just what you do. Like it's not like it's not as if his nephew has ever questioned. I think of a line in The Departed when Leonardo DiCaprio, his mother his mother dies, and the brother, I think his uncle, shows up at his funeral. This is a deep cut, but shows up at the funeral and starts talking to him about lecturing him about his life or whatever. And Leo goes, as the son, he goes, you know, and I'm going to butcher this because it's been a while since I've seen The Departed, but he says, maybe you should be thinking about how like all the things you did and all the decisions that you made led to your children being screwed up. Maybe you should not be coming down here and telling me how I'm screwed up. Maybe you should go fix your own house and stop trying to give me a lecture, right? And the Baron's nephew understands that things are screwed up, but he's a fish in the water. He's not going to question the water.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say. There's not a link between. There's not someone in between to make that. Whereas the uncle is
Yeah.
like the surrogate message, like hey, or Leonardo, like
Mm-hmm.
that relationship where they can be direct and honest with each other.
Right.
Everything else is stratagem because there are so many other people involved. So I think having like a right hand man is really valid, or a right hand person is really valid, because then you have someone to bounce ideas off of, and there's like another another fail stop before kind of following through with whatever, because it could be things could be a reaction to something.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it just seems I don't know, more palatable to have a larger network rather than being the godhead.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring this up because Duke Leto was surrounded by a bunch of different advisors, all of whom were giving him different information. The Baron, on the other hand, seems to be lacking in a good number two, and and he doesn't want a good number two. By the way, he's fine with himself. He's cool. He's cool with like how all this is working out, right? Because it's working out to benefit him. And you see this in when he betrays the Duke Leto. We're going to talk about this in just a minute, or not betrays, but the conspiracy unfolds right against Duke Leto, and we'll talk about this in a minute as we go into the back end of our conversation here today. But he kidnaps not kidnaps. He takes the basically the male mental manipulator, the mentant, and sort of tries to turn him, right, or thinks he has successfully turned him. And that guy could have been a really good number two for you, but you just wanted to manipulate him. You don't want a good number two, right? And one of the things in my career that I've sort of, in every entrepreneurial kind of adventure that I've ever gone on, and I've been an entrepreneur for a long time. Dan, I haven't had a regular job in a long time. 15 years, haven't had a regular job, right? I'm trying to keep that streak going. And some days it's a little bit more close run than others. But one of the things that I've noticed as an entrepreneur, as a starter, as a person who does projects, is you either have to have a good number two, or you have to be a good number two. And you kind of have to figure that out like right there. Like you kind of have to figure out where you're sitting in the hierarchy sort of immediately. If you don't, then you wind up wandering around with a lot of confusion. You wind up wandering around, and maybe you're the villain, maybe you're the hero, but the project will move forward at a certain point underneath its own inertia, whatever it is. But to have a good advisor or be a good advisor is critical, and you got to figure that out quite quickly.
And a wonderful example is in the show The Walking Dead, where
Yes.
Norman Reedus' character is clearly on the one team, but he's always sort of hovering around.
Right.
So it's like the autonomy of the individual, yet he's contributing to the larger
group. Yeah. Back to the book. Back to Dune. We're going to talk a little bit about hierarchy and monarchy, and if you're going to overthrow a government, what's the best way to do that? What's the best way to stage a rebellion if you're going to indeed do that? And so back to the book, back to Dune. Jessica awoke in the dark, feeling premonition in the stillness around her. She could not understand why her mind and body felt so sluggish. Skin raspings of fear ran along her nerves. She thought of sitting up and turning on a light, but something stayed the decision. Her mouth felt strange. Lump, lump, lump. It was a dull sound, directionless in the dark somewhere. The waiting moment was packed with time, with rustling needlestick movements. She began to feel her body, grew aware of bindings on wrists and ankles, a gag in her mouth. She was on her side, hands tied behind her. She tested the bindings, realized they were crim scale fiber, would only claw tighter as she pulled, and now she remembered. There had been movement in the darkness of her bedroom, something wet and pungent slapping against her face, filling her mouth, hands grasping for her. She had gasped one indrawn breath, sensing the narcotic in the wetness. Consciousness had receded, sinking her into a black bin of terror. It has come, she thought. How simple it was to subdue the Ben Gesserit. All it took was treachery. Hawat was right. She forced herself not to pull on her bindings. This is not my bedroom, she thought. They've taken me someplace else. Slowly, she marshaled the inner calmness. She grew aware of the smell of her own stale sweat with its chemical infusion of fear. Where is Paul? She asked herself. My son, what have they done to my head? What have they done to him? Calmness. She forced herself to it using the ancient routines. But the terror remained so near. Leto, where are you, Leto? She sensed it diminishing in the dark. It began with shadows. Dimensions separated, became new thorns of awareness. White, a line under a door. I'm on the floor. People walking. She sensed it through the floor. Jessica squeezed back the memory of terror. I must remain calm, alert, and prepared. I make it only one chance. Again, she forced the inner calmness. The ungainly thumping of her heartbeat even, shaping out over time. She counted back. I was unconscious about an hour. She closed her eyes, focused her awareness onto the approaching footsteps. 4 people. She counted the differences in their steps. I must pretend I'm still unconscious. She relaxed against the cold floor, testing her body's readiness, heard a door open, sensed increased light through her eyelids. Feet approached, someone standing over her. You are awake, rumbled a basso voice. Do not pretend. She opened her eyes. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen stood over her. Around them, she recognized the cellar room where Paul had slept, saw his cot in one side empty. Dispenser lamps were brought in by guards, distributed near the open door. There was a glare of light in the hallway. Beyond that, hurt her eyes. She looked up at the Baron. He wore a yellow cape that bulged over his portable suspensors. The fat cheeks were 2 cherubic mounds beneath spider-black eyes. The drug was timed, he rumbled. We knew to the minute when you'd be coming out of it. How could that be, she wondered. They'd have to know my exact weight, my metabolism, my... Yua! Such a pity you must remain gagged, the Baron said. We could have had such interesting conversation. Yua, it's the only one it could be, she thought. How? The Baron glanced behind him at the door. Come in, Peter. She had never before seen the man who entered stand beside the Baron, but the face was known, and the man, Peter de Vries, the Mentat assassin. She studied him, hawk features, blue ink eyes that suggested he was a native of Arrakis, but subtleties of movement and stance told her he was not, and his flesh was too well firmed with water. He was tall though slender, and something about him suggested effeminacy. I'm going to stop there because that's the first indication we have that something's about to go radically, ridiculously sideways, that there was another plot afoot. I'm a big fan of the show The Wire from way back in the day. I'm a huge fan of that show. And Omar had a great line in The Wire. He said, if you come at the king, you best not miss. And that is absolutely the truth. And the Baron, for all of his internalized knowledge, missed. he missed the thing that he was supposed to hit. He thought he hit the target, but he didn't. Now, what is set up in Dune is a monarchical structure. It's a monarchy. There's barons, there's kings, there's dukes, there's all these kinds of indicators of a monarchical structure, not a democratic one. And we are uncomfortable with monarchy. But the fact is, we are at the end of a managerial culture, I believe, fundamentally in America. That doesn't mean there won't be managers in the future. There will always be managers, there always have been. But we are reshuffling around the kind of ways in which we think about how all of this goes together. And I don't know what the solution is. But Dune proposes one. Interstellar colonization. But such a large-scale project requires the deploying of critical human resources, including human will, that we currently cannot fathom accomplishing. And probably the only system that puts that will out there in a focused way is, quite frankly, a hierarchical monarchy. But we're uncomfortable with that. There's also the issue of cycles rearing their ugly head as you bring every element of being human to the table. There's a challenge that's presented in Dune, and it starts with the way in which Duke Leto goes to Arrakis, the way in which he reacts to the spice trade, right? The decisions he decides he's going to make, to Ryan's point earlier about these characters deciding things that other characters deciding things in this play moves forward. It starts there with the Duke, but it continues even through the Duke's betrayal and through the rise of Paul Atredies as this mythical messiah. By the way, when you call a 15-year-old a messiah, you're going to have a problem. Just a pro tip. Just a pro tip from someone who knows. It's going to be a real problem. And so the challenge of the system being designed to do what it does, right, or to be what it is presented to us in Dune. And it is a challenge that arises in every generation, either at the individual level or at the state level. And so as we turn our corner in our conversation here with Dan, I want to get his thoughts on this. How can leaders avoid being thoughtless bureaucrats, whether they're in a hierarchical monarchical system or an egalitarian democratic one? Because it seems to be a drift. And that is the drift, I think, partially also that got Duke Leto to the spot where he was at. He didn't seem to be able to stop the bureaucratic drift. How do we do that as leaders?
Yeah, that's certainly a tough one. Organizational structures are critical, put you farther and farther away from the people in your market. The larger the organization gets, the larger your enterprise gets. And so it's a tough challenge. I certainly don't have the answer. But we all become frustrated with bureaucrats, right? The definition of someone who's a little bit more concerned with procedure, policy than people. One of the things that I think there's a couple things, one, both of which kind of connect back to one previous theme that we were touching on, and then two, maybe even a lesson that I took away from Dune. The first one, back to earlier, the conversation around having a series of good advisors around us, right? People who are in touch with people, who are in touch with the market, and who can objectively advise us as leaders. I've always liked the concept of the sort of personal board of directors for you and your life, your career being your enterprise that you're leading, and having advisors that you can bounce things off of to stay on course, to check yourself, to avoid becoming the villain, to kind of come back to that earlier piece. I think the other is, staying in touch with your market, with your people, requires constant movement, right? Constant innovation. And we, as again, coming back to our baser nature as humans, which we talked about before, we want to be comfortable, some more than others. And so it's natural to just become like, let's just go with bureaucratic flow. But there's a line in the book, I think, that says, Paul, referencing Paul, fought the temptation to choose a clear and safe path, warning, and I'm again, don't know I'm exactly on point here, warning that leads ever down into stagnation,
Hmm.
which we know, right? So I think the implication there being that, especially as an entrepreneur, you know this well, Jesan, the constant energy, action, innovation keeps you sharp, keeps you in touch with your market, keeps you up to date on what's happening and hopefully ahead of and seeing what's coming next. And also speaks to the importance of, especially as a leader, as an entrepreneur, your willingness and the importance of stretching yourself intellectually, even physically, is what's necessary to maintain your professional success. And sometimes that requires blowing up the ship, if you will. And by that I mean moving on to the next thing and exiting the stage.
Right.
It's time for the next chapter, and knowing when that is, right? Which, again, this is a podcast on films and pop culture. I always appreciated, I think it was the actor who played Captain America talked about that too.
Oh,
like,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
like this was the right moment. I don't want to come back to this character. Like, we left it on such a high note. Like, that was the right moment. Leave before they ask you to. So
Never outstay a climax. back to the T. Lawrence. Never do that. Yeah. Okay.
That's all I got. I don't have the answer right.
You don't have the answer yet. I don't think anybody does. I think it's a challenge that, quite frankly, I mean, and we cover the state papers of the United States on this podcast in the month of July. So we talk about the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist arguments for the Constitution, the Anti-Federalist arguments against the Constitution, and typically we will focus on a particular amendment or a Supreme Court decision. Usually those are released in June, that impacts the way we think about the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the state papers of the United States and you look at the level of thought that those men put into the creation of those documents that laid the keel for the United States of America, that we all kind of just take for granted. You look at the intentionality that they put into that, and even they didn't have, I'm just a schmuck hosting a book podcast. Like, I'm not trying to create a country here. They were trying to create a country, and even they didn't have an answer to that question, right? With all of their intentionality and everything that they brought to the game. And so I admire the effort to go to, and we'll talk about solutions to problems here in a minute. I admire, the effort of talking about a solution versus just continually masticating over a problem. And we have to put something out there, right? I mean, we can't just keep talking about the problem. Ryan, one of the interesting things about Dune is that it is a epic tale, but it's an epic tale about human beings marshaling their resources. It's as if all of the descendants of Elon Musk all of a sudden got together. All 14 of his kids that he's got all got together, and like 1,000 years from now, we're all just going to be descendants of Elon Musk, right? You're going to wipe out the people that don't have the ability to marshal the human resources, and we're just going to go, okay, thanks. And you get that sense from Dune that all these people, in particular, by the way, and I haven't talked about the religious elements, Dan, but like I love how they talk about the OC translation of the Bible, and I'm like, what is he even talking about here? But it's interesting because I have said repeatedly on this show that the Bible is the one book that resists the algorithm. It resists the machinations and the manipulations of people, and it instead changes. It's the one of maybe 2 or 3 books on the planet that actually changes you. You don't change it. It actually changes you. And it's interesting that that's the book that's or some variation of it, that's going to make it to the stars in Herbert's world. I say all that to say this. My question for Ryan is this: how can what should leaders be focused on? Should they be focused on marshaling their resources, controlling human willpower? Like, where should leaders place their focus first?
It depends on the size of the community they're leading, I would think, is enormous. I mean, are you talking about a family unit? Are you talking about a community? And in this case, we're talking about the world.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We're talking about interstellar
And
travel.
so
Yeah.
when you bring it to that scale, yeah, there's zero. I mean, I think there's an episode of Transformers from the 80s that deals with it when one of the Transformers is an entire planet, but I don't know if that's applicable here. Um, a lot of the so what I also have written down is Paul's decision to do the difficult thing would make David Goggins proud, and
Would Who's got to carry the boats? Who's got to carry
and,
the logs?
and so a couple of things, the bureaucratic things, like making something my sister said to me a while back was like when you make your decisions based on like a moral model, then you're not, which is you're talking about the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
You're making decisions on a moral model, so I don't have to tease through if there's something that I disagree with, this does not line up with my, kind of like my spiritual center, then it kind of makes the decision for me. But we're not talking about people in this book relocating jobs because it's not a good fit. We're talking about the leader marshaling resources and allies. And not, well, if that's not their responsibility on some level, at least some variation of, because I don't want to be as sort of absolute as controlling human willpower. That's
Mm-hmm.
But what is a leader's responsibility if not securing the area that you're occupying?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, that's a great question. What is a leader's responsibility? And that is, I mean, that's the depth of the pool that we're in right now. I mean, I think we're 300 episodes total into this podcast over the last 2.5 years. We're like we go at 150 or 160 shorts episodes right now. We got 123. This is episode number 123. And I still don't know what the answer to that question is. What is a leader's responsibility?
Well, just to keep it to like the restaurant industry is like set up whoever you're working with or for success. So just to set up the person for success.
Right.
Now, but there's so many different channels that this can go. I mean, what is success for someone in the world of Dune?
Right. Yeah. Well, the Baron, right? What was success for him versus what was success for his nephew versus what was success for Paul versus what was success for the Freeman, what was success for Duke Leto, Jessica. We haven't even talked about the Ben Gesserit because we haven't even gone there. That's a whole podcast episode in and of itself, but that's a whole conversation that can be had about feminism, female leadership, female followership, like the shift that happens between the second book and the third book, where she realizes that she has to take a backseat to her own son, and she intentionally does so. I know that there are women who do that.
Is there a comment on charlatanism as well?
Yeah, well, okay, frame that out for us. What do you mean? What do you mean about charlatanism?
Because I keep going back to the Chris knife scene.
Okay, yeah.
It's pure chance. And it's off of the lure of the Messiah and the Bene Gesserit feeding into it.
Right.
And not necessarily even, believing it. It's just willing it to happen.
Right. Willing it into existence.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, and then you see sort of Paul's relation to the Freeman when he finally escapes the betrayal and finally escapes, being assassinated, winds up out in the desert. And now he's to go back to T.E. Lawrence for just a minute, he's with the interstellar version of nomadic Arabs, which is the image I had in my head. And Herbert doesn't describe horses, but you can definitely, like, you can see them, like, they're this mass of unorganized, and that's that's not accurate, but the image you have in your head is this mass of unorganized people who just need a leader, and they'll follow behind this guy because he's going to bring them to the promised land. And that then cycles back into the whole idea of, to your point about misunderstanding, is he really the guy, or was he just the guy that was just standing there, or the kid that was just standing there? Could it have been anybody? A lot of different complicated things inside of Dune, which is what makes it worthwhile to read, and which is why it's been read for the last, well over 50 years now. And it has, like I said, laid the keel for world building. All right, rounding the corner here.
Can I jump
go
in
ahead, Dan.
on that one? Just to Ryan, I don't know if you've seen the more recent film, but one of the things that film does a pretty good job of is drawing attention to the manipulation that was taking place with the Bene Gesserit and all of that, which is a whole other commentary on sort of, it's prophecy, was this real, what is the role of prophecy and all of that. But back to the earlier, Jesan, your question around, the role of a leader, the purpose of a leader. I think that I'd be remiss if we didn't call out and underscore just, I think, one of the most, again, bring it back to the book, bring about some of the more blatant lessons of the book, or statements at least of the book, that, again, it maybe feel like an oversimplification, but I think the most important things are, what is important for a leader is that which makes him a leader, right? His people. And so, to Ryan's point and your analogy about the restaurant industry, right? Setting someone else up for success, doing your best by them to ensure that they are successful. I really like that, Ryan. Like, that is a great little analogous capture of the role of a leader on a one-to-one individual level, is to best take care of the person beside you. And if you can do that on a group scale, on a nation scale, as our protagonist does, or at least is perceived to be doing by the people, then those are the leaders that are going to be remembered, because again, they're living out some of the most important axioms, which come back to the book that survived, at least in some way, shape, or form, 10,000 years into the future, right?
Right.
Orange Catholic Bible, as it's referred to.
The OC Bible, yeah. Which, by the way, when I first read that, when it first like dropped into the narrative, I thought, wait, what? I had to go back and read it again. It kind of caught me by surprise. Okay, rounding the corner here, solutions to problems, right? So we live in a time, and this is one of the things that I've been talking about on this podcast this year, Dan. This has been the theme of this year. Driven by the theme of the podcast this year has been, let's focus on solutions to problems, because we spend a lot of time talking about problems. We are in the midst, I fundamentally believe, of the fourth turning. If you know about that generational theory model from William Strauss and Neil Howe, there are 4 cycles in history that coincide with the seasons of life, right? So you have spring, summer, fall, and winter. And you have generations that are inside of each one of those seasons over the course of an 80-year cycle who experience all these things roughly together. And so currently in our world, and you can research this theory, but currently in our world, we have the baby boomers, we have Gen Xers, we have the millennials, and we have Gen Zers, right? Those are the 4 that are going through the current secular cycle, which, according to Strauss and Howe in their theory of cycle in history and of generations in history, that cyclical end is either coming up by the end of by the beginning of 2030, or by the end of 2040. Just depends sort of where we're at with that. And I look at the experiences that I've had in my career, and I look at the chaos that has occurred ever since September 11th in our country, moral chaos, financial chaos. We as of this recording, there's a hurricane that's hitting Florida, right? Biggest hurricane in a long, long time, right? And I'm not quite sure that we are going to have the competency at the federal government level that we would have had 25 or 30 years ago to address that issue. And there's always crises of competencies when you're on the back end of a historical cycle, when you're in a historical winter, which I think is what America is in now. So I say all that to say this. Winter always turns into spring. And my concern, and one of the reasons why I do this podcast, is that if you've been in winter for so long and you've just been in survival mode, when spring shows up, A, you don't believe it, and B, you wreck it. So one of the things we've really focused on this year has been, how do these books set us up for the springtime that is coming? I do believe we are at the end of a winter chaos cycle in America in particular, and in the West in general. I do believe things are coalescing and reshaping, politically, socially, morally, ethically. The core things that make us human aren't being reshaped. It's just how we react and respond to them that is being reshaped, and the tools that we're using. But spring is coming. It invariably always does. There is a high time coming. It's not just all low. And I look at a book like Dune. Now, this is where this ties in. I look at a book like Dune, and a Messiah character or a Messiah concept is always a concept for a high time rather than a chaotic time. A Messiah can come out of chaos, but invariably a Messiah has to exist in a spring, maybe a summer. Fall is usually a time of unraveling. This is why, and you can see this actually, the great show back in the day that was on ABC, NYPD Blue. I'm actually like wandering through that right now and watching all those seasons, and it is the perfect unraveling show. It's perfect for like in America where we spent 25 years trying to figure out why we were unraveling, and now we're unraveled and we're trying to figure out how to get it all back together. But a Messiah doesn't come along in a fall. A Messiah usually comes along in a winter, a chaotic period, or an insurgent, right? Does. But then they build in the spring, and then they become a gatekeeper, and then they unravel. Institutions unravel, people unravel, the whole thing falls apart, and then you're back to where you started. And we're there right on time, I think, socially and morally and ethically. Insurgents kick over the board, right, when they create new systems, right? And I'm seeing a bunch of insurgents floating around these days in our time. Politics is the biggest place where we see this. RFK Jr. would be an insurgent, right? Or Tulsi Gabbard would be an insurgent, right? By the way, those are two people that if their party had picked them to run for presidency in our time, I think they probably would have beaten Donald Trump. I think that's a ticket that beats Donald Trump. But because the Democrat Party is unraveling, they can't pick that person. They can't pick those people, right? And so or not unraveling, it's in chaos. It's an internal chaos. It long since unraveled, but it's an internal chaos. By the way, just like the Republican Party, internal chaos, right? My point in saying all this is this. I started off this podcast by saying that there's deserts everywhere, even in your head. And deserts are a place, weirdly enough, of heat and light, but they are also a place of winter. They are arid. There's nothing there. In thinking about Dune and in thinking about leadership, how can leaders take lessons? This is a question for both of you. How can leaders take questions or take inspiration and take understanding from Dune to build towards the next secular spring? What are the solutions to the problems that leadership is having right now that we'll be able to build on the other side of, 2030? Which is, again, and that's when I think it's going to be over, like on the other side of 2030, or even further out on the other side of 2040. What do leaders need to do? What do they need to take from Dune to start building solutions to problems?
I look at you say insurgents. I look at the how immigration is played out, especially in England and the United States, and if you have something that is desirable and people want, they're probably going to keep coming to try and get it until they're forced to stop.
Right.
Seems to be what kind of the situation is in that context I just mentioned of immigration. So, I mean, yeah, there's a target on your back if you're at the top of the mountain. That's it.
Yeah.
Jesan, I think at a meta level, with respect to Dune, I think it does come back to the most important lesson from the book, or at least the author's intended most important lesson from the book, and one that I didn't necessarily take from it when I first read it at 14, which is the danger of following overly charismatic leaders, which I think we've got a lot of people right now, not to get overly political in this country, following someone that is at least considered by some to be charismatic, and mindlessly doing so. And I'll leave that there.
Yeah, leave that.
But,
Put a pin in that.
but I do think it also reflects back to the importance of thinking for ourselves and keeping ourselves sharp. Like again, to talk about, not choosing kind of the safe, clear path of doing nothing and just kind of following the flow, but keeping our edge as leaders, but also continuing to think for ourselves and challenge the current thinking that's out there, which, as cliche as that sounds, and as often as it is said, of course it's not done, and we're all guilty of getting too comfortable and just kind of throwing our hands up and like, I'm not even gonna engage. Bringing it back to the book, one of the things that, and this is probably one of the reasons Elon Musk liked the book, apparently, or at least so I'm told, is that there's a line that says something to the effect of, you could say that Muad'Dib, Paul, learned quickly because his first teaching or learning was in the act of learning. And of course, I think the lesson there is that leadership requires effective thinking, which requires the effective consuming of knowledge and distillation of it very quickly. And coming from a business school environment, which is where I'm coming from, having gone to business school and then taught in a business school, that's the whole thing in business school. It's like, reading a business case, sifting through all the crap, and quickly getting to the bottom line. But it's also reinforces the common phrase, which we as parents have tried to instill in our daughters, which is, leaders are readers. And the importance there is you're learning to think for yourself, consume information, yes, and then think for yourself on that. And that is also, if done frequently, constantly, effectively, keep us, on track with respect to the important lessons that we learned from the past seasons. So it's not to hopefully repeat them as well, which is why I've continued to come back to and wish that I had studied history as a major in undergrad, which as helpful as I think that would be, and as practical a subject area, more so than a lot. So.
Yeah.
I have one more thing to add to my not offering any solution with a target on your back. Foresight. The thing that you say, hey son, when people are like, we have to tear it down. Well, what are you going to put in its place? What is the solution to the issue that you're having?
Yeah, there has to be.
You can't just solve chaos with chaos.
Correct. Right. Exactly. And sowing chaos for, I'm going to use religious language here, sowing chaos for the remission of sins, past sins, doesn't actually build for your future. It doesn't actually build for the next thing. Not unless you're a Messiah that can sort of give out absolution.
Or are you living in the past otherwise?
Right, exactly. You're just living in the past otherwise, which is why I don't want, you and I have talked about this before, Ryan, but like I don't want things torn down. I want things to stay up. Let's build on top of them, right? Let's use those things, those concepts, those ideas, dare I say, even those statues and those buildings, to build the next thing, to go in the next space. But again, that's springtime thinking. And I do believe that, well, as I said before, in my long run up to my question, I do believe spring is coming. And I think it's long past time for us to stop talking about the problems and to begin to at least propose even if they are radical sounding, propose some solutions to whatever the problems are we believe we are having. All right.
That is a high note, Jesan. I like
It is a high note, and I'm going to go out on it.
Much more catchy than Game of Thrones Winter is Coming. I like that spring is coming. And also bring you back to the Dark Knight.
Mm-hmm.
Night is darkest just before the dawn. Spring is coming. Right? So I like that.
So
Thank you.
optimistic. I feel great.
Oh, I'm pragmatically optimistic. Absolutely. I would like to thank both Dan Bentle and Ryan Stout for joining me today on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. And with that, well, we're out.
Have a beautiful day.
Thank you so much, Jesan. Ryan?
Dan, pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.